My name is Dorothy Caldwell, and at 64 years old, I thought the hardest battles of my life were already behind me. I thought I'd already survived the worst. Burying my husband of 31 years, raising a son alone through the grief that followed, working double shifts at the accounting firm until my hands shook from exhaustion just so Ethan could graduate from college without debt. I thought the wars were over. I was wrong. The real war hadn't started yet, and when it came, it didn't arrive with trumpets or warnings. It arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning in October, with the sound of car doors slamming too hard in my driveway. I was in my backyard tending to my late-blooming roses when I heard it. The engine sound was familiar. Ethan's Ford Explorer, black, the one I'd helped him pick out 3 years ago because it had the best safety ratings. But something in the way the doors closed made me set down my pruning shears. Too sharp, too final, like punctuation at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to read aloud. I wiped my hands on my gardening apron, the faded blue one with the embroidered daisies that my neighbor Ruth Holloway had given me for my birthday, and walked around to the front of my house. My house. 2 stories, pale yellow siding that I'd repainted myself the summer after Gerald died, hardwood floors that creaked in exactly the same 3 spots they'd always creaked, a front porch where I'd drunk coffee every morning for 28 years, paid off, every board, every brick, every stubborn creak in those floors. Mine. When I came around the corner, I saw Ethan first. My son is 36 years old and was built, as his father used to say, like a man who takes care of himself. But the man standing on my porch that morning looked like someone had taken that man and left something hollowed out in his place. His Oxford shirt was wrinkled in a way that suggested he'd slept in it. His tie was pulled loose and crooked. The dark circles under his eyes were the kind that don't come from one bad night. They come from months of nights stacked on top of each other like stones. Then I saw Vanessa. My daughter-in-law stood beside 2 Louis Vuitton suitcases on my front porch like she was waiting for a bellhop. Her blonde hair was freshly blown out. Her makeup was perfect. She wore a cream-colored wrap dress that I would later learn cost $480, and her eyes moved across the front of my house with a slow, evaluating calm. The way a person looks at something they're considering purchasing. She wasn't checking into a hotel. She was checking into my home. I just didn't know it yet. "Mom," Ethan Sarah said, and his voice did something it hadn't done since he was 12 years old and had to tell me he'd broken the kitchen window with a baseball. It cracked right down the middle. "We need to talk." I unlocked the front door without a word and held it open. They followed me inside, their footsteps and the rolling weight of suitcases moving across my hardwood floors. I noticed Vanessa's eyes continuing their quiet inventory. The living room furniture, the framed photographs on the mantel, the small oil painting of Cape Cod that Gerald and I had bought on our 20th anniversary. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the pot I'd made at 6 that morning. My hands were steady. That surprised me. Something in my chest already knew that steadiness was about to become the most important thing I owned. "Sit down," I said. Ethan sat in the old recliner by the window. His father's chair, the one I'd kept because I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it, and because somehow Ethan always gravitated toward it, the way children gravitate toward the spaces where they felt safe. Vanessa sat on the sofa and crossed her legs and looked at her hands. I sat in the chair across from them and waited. "Mom," Ethan began, "we have something to tell you." "I'm listening." He glanced at Vanessa. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind of nod a director gives an actor who's forgotten their line. "We sold the house," he said. 3 words. I set my coffee cup down on the saucer very carefully, because something in me understood that the next few minutes required precision. "Which house?" I asked, though my stomach already knew. "Our house. The one on Birchwood Lane. The one on Birchwood Lane. I want you to understand what that house meant. 4 years ago, when Ethan and Vanessa were looking to buy, I had given them $45,000 from my retirement savings for the down payment. Not a gift, a loan, properly documented, with a promissory note and a recorded lien against the property, because Robert Whitfield, the real estate attorney who handled the closing, had insisted, and because Ethan himself had insisted alongside him. "Mom, I want to do this right. I want to pay you back properly." Those were his exact words. I'd spent 3 weekends helping them paint every room. I'd planted the rose bushes along the front walk. I'd driven over with casseroles when they moved in and stayed up until midnight assembling flat-pack furniture because Vanessa didn't want to wait for the delivery service. That house was 4 years of my retirement money, my weekends, my hands. You sold it, I said. It wasn't a question. Yes. How much? $645,000, Vanessa said before Ethan could answer. Her voice carried something I can only describe as brightness, the kind that doesn't belong in a room where hard news is being delivered. I looked at my son. That's wonderful equity. So where are you moving? Did you find something bigger? Better school district, maybe? The silence that followed was not the silence of people searching for the right words. It was the silence of people who already know the words and don't want to say them. Ethan stared at his hands. Vanessa examined a perfectly manicured nail. We were hoping, Ethan finally said, that we could stay here, with you, just temporarily while we figure things out. I sat very still. Stay here, I repeated. Just for a little while. A few months, maybe. We wouldn't be any trouble. The word trouble hung in the air between us, and I thought, you brought 2 Louis Vuitton suitcases to my front porch on a Tuesday morning without a phone call. Trouble arrived with the luggage, but I kept my voice even, because I had one question that needed answering before anything else. What happened to the money from the sale? Another silence. This one had weight to it. Well, Vanessa said, smoothing her dress with one hand, there were expenses, things that needed to be taken care of. What kind of expenses? Personal things. I put my coffee cup down again, more firmly this time. Vanessa, you just sold a house for $645,000. What personal things cost $645,000? She sighed, the way a person sighs when they're being asked to explain something they consider beneath explanation. Then she began listing, with the casual tone of someone reading from a grocery receipt. There were credit cards, about $85,000 in debt that she needed to pay off. Debt, she mentioned without particular emphasis, that had existed before the marriage. There was an investment in her friend's boutique business, $310,000, which she said with genuine enthusiasm, describing it as a real opportunity. There was jewelry, spa trips. She'd taken one to Scottsdale with her sister, which we really needed. There was car detailing and interior upgrades, gifts for her family, some furniture for the boutique to help it get started. I calculated while she talked. Even being conservative, I couldn't make the numbers disappear. Every dollar was gone. The credit card debt, I said carefully. $85,000. Ethan, did you know about this debt before you were married? My son raised his eyes to mine for just a moment, then looked away. No, he said quietly. I found out after. And the boutique, I said, turning back to Vanessa. $310,000 invested in your friend's business. She's very talented, Vanessa said. It's going to do very well. What's the name of the boutique? A pause so brief most people would have missed it. It's still in the setup phase. These things take time. I looked at my son. He was looking at the floor, and I understood, with the terrible clarity that sometimes arrives all at once, that I was not looking at 2 people who had made poor decisions together. I was looking at one person who had made decisions and one person who had watched them happen and said nothing, because somewhere along the way, he had lost the ability to say anything at all. I can't let you stay here, I said. The temperature in this room changed. Ethan's head came up. Mom, I'm not saying this to punish you. I'm saying it because letting you move in while you figure out what comes next is not helping you. It's helping you avoid the conversation you need to be having. Vanessa uncrossed her legs and sat forward. The conversation we need to be having, she repeated, her voice taking on a new quality. Sharper, like a key turning in a lock. You mean the conversation where you tell us we're not welcome in your home? That's not what I said. It's what you mean. You've never welcomed me in this family. From the day Ethan brought me home, you've looked at me like I was something he tracked in on his shoe. Vanessa? No. She stood up. I'm tired of being diplomatic about this. You have never given me a fair chance. Everything I do is wrong. Everything I spend is irresponsible. Every decision we make together is somehow my fault. And now, when we need help, when your own son needs help, you're going to sit there in your little house with your little coffee cup and tell us no. I stood up too. My little house, I said, that I paid for, alone, after your husband's father died, while I was working full-time and raising a son and trying to keep a life together. This house that I never once asked anyone to hand to me. Something flickered across Vanessa's face. She hadn't expected me to answer like that. She'd expected me to apologize, or to soften, or to do what I imagine most people did when Vanessa Harlow turned up the temperature. Retreat. I didn't retreat. I think you should both go, I said. Take some time. Make a plan. If Ethan wants to talk to me, just Ethan. He knows my number. That's when Vanessa walked toward the front door, pulled it open hard enough that it swung back against the wall, and stepped out onto the porch. What happened next is something I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count, not because I wish it had gone differently, but because it was the moment everything changed, the moment a private family argument became something that existed in the world, witnessed and recorded and real. Ruth Holloway was across the street watering her hydrangeas. She was 70 years old and had lived on that block for longer than I had, and she had the particular alertness of a woman who has raised 4 children and knows the sound of trouble the way a musician knows an off note. The teenage boy from the house next door, the Petersons' son, Tyler, had just started up the lawnmower. He shut it off when the shouting started. The mail carrier, a man I knew only as Dave, had stopped his truck 3 houses down. "Do you want to know what kind of woman Dorothy Caldwell really is?" Vanessa called out, her voice carrying across the quiet street with the practiced projection of someone who has done this before. "She's throwing her own son out, her own flesh and blood. We asked for help, temporary help, just a place to stay, and she slammed the door in our faces." I stepped out onto my porch. "Vanessa, come inside." "No." She turned to face me, and the tears came then, fast, convincing, the kind that arrive on cue. "Let them hear. Let them all hear what kind of mother does this to her child." Ruth Holloway had set down her watering can. "We have nowhere to go," Vanessa continued, her voice breaking perfectly on the last word. "We came to her because we had nowhere else, and she said no. She said no to her own son." I stood on my porch and looked at this woman performing grief for an audience of neighbors on a Tuesday morning, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not humiliation, but a profound and clarifying calm. "Vanessa," I said, my voice steady and low, "you have 30 seconds to come back inside, or I am calling the police." She laughed, a short, hard sound. "Go ahead. Call them. Tell them you're throwing your family out on the street." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said quietly, "I'm not calling them for that." She stepped toward me. Close, too close. "You think you're better than me," she said, her voice dropping to something private and vicious, meant only for me. "You sit in this rundown little house in your old clothes driving your old car, and you think that makes you better. You have nothing. You are nothing. And your son, your precious son, he chose me. He chose me over you, and you have never forgiven either of us for it." I didn't answer. I just looked at her. And then Vanessa Harlow raised her right hand and slapped me across the face. The sound of it carried. I know, because Ruth Holloway told me afterward that she heard it from across the street, a sharp, flat crack in the morning quiet. I know because Tyler Peterson, who was 17 and had never seen anything like it, stood frozen with his hands still on the lawnmower handles, staring. I know because Dave the mail carrier set down his bag and reached for his phone. I didn't fall. I didn't cry. I stood on my front porch with my hand raised slowly to my cheek, and I looked at my daughter-in-law. Behind her, in the doorway of my house, Ethan stood. He had witnessed everything. His wife's performance for the neighbors, the words she'd said to me in private, the moment her hand had connected with my face. He stood in the doorway, and he did not move. I looked at my son, the boy I had held during thunderstorms, the teenager I had driven to every baseball practice and every SAT prep session, the young man I had pressed $45,000 of my retirement savings into so he could have a home of his own. I looked at him, and I waited. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the ground. I reached into the pocket of my gardening apron and took out my phone. 911, I said when the dispatcher answered. "My name is Dorothy Caldwell. I need an officer at my address. I've been assaulted by my daughter-in-law. I have multiple witnesses." Vanessa's face changed. The performance evaporated. What was left underneath it was something I hadn't quite seen before. Not anger, not grief, but calculation. Pure, cold calculation, running behind her eyes like a program reassessing its options. "Hang up that phone," she said quietly. I kept talking to the dispatcher. "Ethan," Vanessa turned to my son. "Tell her to hang up the phone." Ethan looked at his wife. Then he looked at me, at my hand against my cheek, at the neighbors watching from their yards. He looked like a man who had just woken up in a room he didn't recognize. He didn't tell me to hang up. Officer Dana Reyes arrived 8 minutes later in a patrol car, accompanied by a second officer named Bradshaw. Officer Reyes was in her mid-30s, with a professional calm that I immediately trusted. She asked me to describe what had happened. She asked Ruth Holloway, who had walked across the street, to describe what she had seen. She asked Tyler Peterson, who confirmed it. She wrote everything down. Then she walked to where Vanessa was standing, her composure reassembled into something nearly convincing. "Ma'am," Officer Reyes said, "did you strike this woman?" It was a family argument. Things got out of hand. I didn't mean, "Ma'am, did you strike her?" Vanessa looked at Ethan. He looked at the ground. "It wasn't," she began. "We have multiple witnesses," Officer Reyes said without inflection. "Do you want to press charges, Mrs. Caldwell?" I looked at my son one more time. I gave him every second I could. I waited for him to look up, to step forward, to say, "Mom, I'm sorry. She's wrong. This is wrong." He stared at the grass. "Yes," I said. "I want to press charges." I watched the patrol car pull away with Vanessa in the back seat. She turned her face away from the window. From me, from Ethan, from the small audience of neighbors who had witnessed everything. Ethan stood on my front walk with his hands in his pockets. His suitcases were still on the porch. He looked suddenly and completely like a 12-year-old boy standing at the edge of something much larger than he knew how to cross. "Ethan," I said. He finally looked at me. "You need to find somewhere to stay tonight. Not here. Not yet." "Mom, I love you. I have always loved you. But I cannot be the place you run to when the consequences of your choices catch up with you. Not this time." His jaw tightened. For a moment I thought he was going to argue, and part of me, the mother part that never fully retires, hoped he would. Anger meant he was still in there somewhere, but he just nodded, slowly, and began loading his suitcases back into the Explorer. I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and let myself feel, for exactly 5 minutes, every bit of what the morning had cost me. The humiliation in front of my neighbors, the mark on my face, the sight of my son standing silent in that doorway. 5 minutes. Then I stood up, went to my file cabinet, and found the folder labeled Birchwood Lane. Purchase documents. The promissory note was exactly where I'd left it. $45,000, structured as a loan at 5% annual interest, secured by a recorded lien against the property. Payments due beginning 12 months after the closing date. I read it twice. They had sold that house. They had received $645,000. They had not paid me back a single cent. They had not even mentioned the outstanding lien. I picked up my phone and called Robert Whitfield. His secretary said he could see me the next morning at 9. I put the note back in the folder, made myself a fresh cup of coffee, and walked out to my garden to finish what I'd started with the roses before the morning had gone sideways. My hands were still steady. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't angry exactly, not yet. What I felt, standing in my garden with pruning shears in the late October light, was something quieter and more durable than anger. I felt resolved, because I had been patient for 4 years. I had bitten my tongue at dinners where Vanessa spoke over me and smiled at me with that particular smile that meant she was tolerating my presence in a room she'd already decided was beneath her. I had driven to Birchwood Lane to help and been thanked with the bare minimum of politeness. I had watched my son become quieter each year, and smaller, and more careful. The way people become careful when they've learned that carefulness is the price of peace in their own home. I had watched all of that, and I had said nothing. I was done saying nothing. Tomorrow I would sit in Robert Whitfield's office and begin the process of saying something, and I had a feeling that what came next would surprise everyone, including me. Robert Whitfield's office smelled like old wood and strong coffee, which had always struck me as exactly right for a man who dealt in documents and consequences. He was 62 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by human behavior somewhere around 1995. When I walked in that Wednesday morning in my good Navy suit, the one I'd worn to Ethan's college graduation, he stood up, shook my hand, and gestured to the chair across from his desk without a word about my cheek, which was still slightly discolored despite the concealer I'd applied that morning. He was too professional to comment, but I saw him notice. I laid the promissory note on his desk and sat down. He read it slowly, turned it over, read it again. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with the careful expression of a man who is organizing several thoughts simultaneously. "Dorothy," he said, "do you understand what you have here? I have a loan they never repaid and a lien on a property they already sold. You have more than that." He tapped the document with one finger. "This lien was properly recorded at the time of the closing. When your son and daughter-in-law sold that property without satisfying this debt first, they didn't just break a promise. They committed what the law calls conversion of secured property. You have grounds for a civil lawsuit, full repayment of the principal, 4 years of interest at the stated rate, legal fees, and damages." "How much total?" He did the arithmetic on a yellow legal pad, turning it so I could see the numbers. Principal plus interest plus documented damages came to approximately $72,000. I nodded. "File it." He looked at me for a moment. "Dorothy, once I file this, it becomes a matter of public record. It will affect your son as well as his wife." "I know." "Are you certain?" "Robert," I said, "my daughter-in-law slapped me in front of my neighbors and my son stood in the doorway and watched it happen. I am entirely certain." He nodded once, wrote something on the legal pad, and then said the thing I hadn't quite expected. "I also want to bring in Gary Purcell before we get to the courtroom." "Who is Gary Purcell?" "The best financial investigator I've worked with in 20 years. Before we go in front of a judge, I want to know exactly where $645,000 went. Because what your daughter-in-law told you in that living room, jewelry, spa trips, credit card debt, a boutique investment, that's a story. I want the facts." I thought about Vanessa's voice as she'd listed those expenses, the casual brightness of it. The way she'd said things add up as though she were explaining why the grocery bill had gone over budget. "Call him," I said. Gary Purcell called Robert Whitfield 4 days later. Robert called me that same afternoon and told me to sit down. I was already sitting. I'd been sitting at my kitchen table since morning, going through 4 years of emails on my laptop. Every message I'd sent to Ethan about the missed payments on the promissory note. Every polite reply from Vanessa explaining that things were tight right now, or that they'd take care of it soon. 3 years of documentation, patient and courteous on my end, evasive and empty on theirs. "Gary found something," Robert said. "About the boutique. Tell me." "There is no boutique, Dorothy." I set down my coffee cup. "No business license, no storefront lease, no LLC filing, no DBA registration, no commercial bank account, no tax ID number. Gary's investigator went to the address Vanessa gave Ethan for the business. It's a nail salon that's been there for 11 years. The $310,000 had been transferred in 2 wire transactions directly into the personal checking account of a woman named Ashley Greer, Vanessa's college roommate, and, according to Gary's preliminary research, her closest friend for the past 15 years. There was no boutique. There had never been a boutique. $310,000 had been handed to a friend with no business plan, no contract, no oversight, and no apparent intention of return. "Is this criminal?" I asked. "Potentially," Robert said. "At minimum, it's civil fraud. Gary is still pulling on threads. I think there's more." There was more. Gary Purcell was thorough. That was the word Robert used, and I came to understand it was a significant understatement. Robert called me again 2 days later. I sat in my living room with the autumn sun coming through the windows and listened as he read from Gary's report. Before Ethan, Vanessa Harlow had been in 2 serious relationships. The first was a man named Brandon Teller, a software engineer in Seattle, 34 at the time, whom Vanessa had dated for 11 months before becoming engaged. Brandon had ended the engagement abruptly and refused to discuss the reason with mutual friends. Gary had tracked him down through professional records and reached out. Brandon had been reluctant to speak, but eventually confirmed. During their engagement, Vanessa had used his credit cards, 3 of them, added to his accounts during a period when he'd given her signing privileges for household expenses, and accumulated $52,000 in debt before he discovered it. He had not pressed charges. He said he'd been too ashamed and that he simply wanted to move forward. The second was a man named Craig Sullivan, a real estate broker in Portland, 38. who had lived with Vanessa for 14 months. Craig's story was slightly different but structurally identical. Vanessa had opened a credit card in his name without his knowledge, run up $38,000 in charges, and been gone before the first collection call arrived. Craig had also not pursued legal action. He said he'd consulted a lawyer, been told it would be a long and costly process, and decided his peace of mind was worth more than the money. 2 men, 2 cities. $90,000 between them. Both too proud, too exhausted, or too beaten down to fight back. Vanessa had not stumbled into financial recklessness with Ethan. She had refined it. She had learned from each relationship what worked and what didn't, and she had arrived at my son's life already expert. I put the phone down after Robert finished reading and sat in my living room for a very long time. I thought about the first time Ethan had brought Vanessa home for dinner, 4 years ago, a Sunday in early spring. I had cooked a roast and made Gerald's mother's apple cake, because that was what we did in this family for people who mattered. Vanessa had been charming in a way that I'd recognized even then as performance rather than warmth. She'd complimented the house with the precise language of someone cataloging rather than appreciating. I had told myself I was being uncharitable. I was not being uncharitable. I was being accurate. I just hadn't trusted myself enough to say so. I should have expected it. Looking back, it was entirely consistent with everything I now knew about how Vanessa operated. When direct confrontation didn't produce the desired result, she changed the stage. I worked part-time at a small accounting firm called Hartley & Associates, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 9 to 3. It was the kind of work I'd taken after retirement to stay useful and sharp, and I loved the quiet steadiness of it, the ledgers, the orderly logic of numbers that always balanced when you did them right. Sandra Owens, our receptionist, called back to my desk on a Thursday afternoon, her voice carrying the carefully neutral tone of someone trying not to alarm anyone. "Mrs. Caldwell? There's a woman here who says she's your daughter-in-law. She says she'll wait as long as it takes. She's making some of the clients a little uncomfortable." I closed my eyes for a count of 3. Then I stood up, straightened my cardigan, and walked to the front office. Vanessa was sitting in the waiting area in what I would estimate was her 3rd most expensive outfit, enough to signal money without seeming to try too hard. She had clearly had her hair done recently. She looked like a woman arriving for a meeting with her financial advisor, not a woman who had been arrested for assault 11 days earlier and whose court date was 3 weeks away. She stood when she saw me. 5 minutes, she said. That's all I'm asking. I was aware of Sandra watching from behind her desk. I was aware of 2 clients in the waiting area doing their best to appear absorbed in their phones. "This is my place of work," I said quietly. "You need to leave. 5 minutes and I will." She kept her voice pleasant, which was somehow worse than if she'd raised it. "I want to talk about settling this, the lawsuit. I think we can work something out without going to court." "Vanessa, please, Dot." She said my nickname with a familiarity I'd never given her permission to use. "I know things have gotten out of hand. I know I handled things badly. I'm trying to make it right. For a moment, and I will admit this because I think honesty matters more than looking strong, for a moment, I almost believed her. That was the thing about Vanessa that I never fully got used to, how completely convincing she could be when she needed to be. The sincerity was indistinguishable from the real thing until you knew to look for the seams. I knew to look for the seams. "If you want to discuss settlement," I said, "you contact Robert Whitfield's office. You do not come to my workplace. You do not contact me directly." Her expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a few degrees, like a thermostat adjusting. The warmth went out of it, and what replaced it was something flatter and more considered. "I'm trying to give you a way out of this that doesn't get ugly," she said. The pleasantness was gone from her voice now. "You should think carefully about whether you want to keep pushing." "Sandra," I said without taking my eyes off Vanessa, "please call Officer Reyes." Vanessa left before the call connected. But on the chair where she'd been sitting, she had left a folded piece of paper. Sandra brought it to me after the front door closed. I unfolded it. 4 words, written in Vanessa's neat, rounded handwriting. I called Ethan that evening. He was staying at a budget motel on the west side of town. He'd told me the name when he called 3 days after the arrest, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it, asking not for money or a place to stay, but just to hear my voice. That call had lasted 40 minutes, and we'd talked about almost nothing consequential, and it had been one of the more important conversations we'd had in years. Now I read him the 4 words on the note. The silence on the other end of the line was answer enough. "Tell me," I said. And he did. In 2021, when they bought the house on Birchwood Lane, Ethan had overstated his annual income on the mortgage application by approximately $22,000. He'd also omitted a student loan balance of $28,000 from his liability disclosures. In 2022, he'd taken on some freelance engineering consulting work, 3 projects, paid in cash, and had not reported the income on his tax return. None of it was catastrophic in isolation. Together, it was enough. Vanessa knew about all of it? She was there when we did the mortgage application. She suggested the income adjustment. She said everyone did it, that the bank built in a cushion for it, that it was just how things worked. He paused. The tax thing. She found out about that afterward. She didn't say anything. She kept the paperwork. She told me it was for our records. Ethan. I know, Mom. She kept it as leverage. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. I thought about the past 3 years, about the way Ethan had grown quieter and more careful and more deferential, about the way he'd watched Vanessa spend money that wasn't hers to spend and said nothing, about the way he'd stood in my doorway while his wife assaulted his mother and found no words. I had thought he was weak. I had thought in my worst moments that I had somehow failed to raise a man who could stand up for the people he loved. What I understood now was that he had been standing inside a cage he'd helped build in the first year of his marriage, and the door had been locked from the outside ever since. You need to call Robert Whitfield tonight, I said. Tell him everything you just told me. Tonight, Ethan, not tomorrow. Mom, if this comes out, if Vanessa brings it out in court, it will be so much worse. If you bring it to Robert now, he can manage it. There's a difference between a man who comes forward and a man who gets caught. You get to choose which one you are. A long silence. Okay, he said finally. Okay, I'll call him. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen in the dark for a while without turning on the lights. I thought about what it meant to love someone who had made serious mistakes. I thought about the difference between accountability and punishment. I thought about Gerald, who had been gone 6 years now, and what he would have said. He would have said, Dorothy, you can feel sad about it and still do the right thing. Those 2 things aren't opposites. I turned on the kitchen light and made a cup of chamomile tea. Gary Purcell's complete report arrived in Robert Whitfield's office on a Tuesday morning, 10 days before the scheduled court date. Robert called and asked me to come in. He also, separately, called Ethan. We sat in Robert's office together for the first time. My son and I, side by side in the 2 chairs across from Robert's desk, the way we'd sat in this same configuration 4 years ago when we were signing documents for a house that was supposed to be the beginning of something good. Robert opened a manila folder and looked at us both. I need to tell you about Theodore Barton, he said. The name meant nothing to me. I watched my son's face. It meant nothing to him either. Robert laid a photograph on the desk. A man in his mid-50s, well-dressed, the kind of face that suggested a life lived comfortably and mostly according to plan. A Range Rover was visible in the background of the photo. Theodore Barton, Robert said, is 54 years old. He owns a commercial real estate development company called Barton & Associates, based in the northwest suburbs. He has been married to his wife Patricia for 26 years. They have 2 adult children. He paused. He and Vanessa have been in a relationship for at least 9 months, possibly longer. The room was very quiet. Robert continued, his voice careful and steady, laying out what Gary Purcell's investigation had uncovered. Hotel receipts from 3 different cities, charged to Theodore Barton's corporate credit card. Restaurant bills. The jewelry Vanessa had described to me as personal expenses. A bracelet, 2 necklaces, a watch. Purchased at a jeweler in the Gold Coast, paid for by Theodore. The spa trip to Scottsdale that she'd called something we needed, booked through a travel agency that Theodore used for company retreats. Vanessa had told Theodore that she was in the process of separating from an abusive husband, that her mother-in-law was attempting to seize her assets through a fraudulent legal claim, and that she needed financial support while she sorted out her situation. Theodore had provided it. 3 weeks before Vanessa arrived at my door with those Louis Vuitton suitcases, Patricia Barton had discovered the affair. She had given her husband a choice. Theodore had ended the relationship immediately and completely. Robert closed the folder. That, he said, is why they needed somewhere to stay. The house had been sold. The money was gone. The outside source of income had been cut off, and Vanessa needed a base of operations while she determined her next move. Ethan had not moved since Robert started speaking. He was sitting very still, the way people sit when they are absorbing something that is reorganizing everything they thought they understood. I did not look at my son while Robert talked. I kept my eyes on the folder on the desk. I thought that he needed whatever privacy was available to him in that moment, and the least I could do was give him the small privacy of not being watched while the architecture of his marriage collapsed in real time. When Robert finished, the silence lasted nearly a full minute. Then Ethan said in a voice I barely recognized, "I want to file for divorce. This week." "Ethan," I began. "Mom." He looked at me, and his eyes were red-rimmed but entirely clear. "I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm telling you what I'm doing." I closed my mouth, nodded. "I'll refer you to a colleague who handles family law," Robert said quietly. "She's very good." We drove to our separate cars in the parking garage without speaking. At my car, Ethan stopped. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and he looked, standing there under the fluorescent lights, like a man who had just walked out of a building he'd been inside for so long he'd forgotten what outside felt like. "I stood in your doorway," he said. "When she hit you, I stood there and I didn't do anything." "I know. I've been doing that for 3 years, standing in doorways." I looked at my son. "You're not standing in a doorway now." He nodded once and walked to his car. The divorce papers were served on a Friday. By Sunday at 5:45 in the morning, Vanessa was on my front porch. My security camera picked her up at the end of the driveway first, a figure moving fast in the pre-dawn dark. Yesterday's clothes, her hair loose and wild in a way I had never seen it. The composed, calculating woman I had known for 4 years had been replaced by something rawer and less controlled, and that, I understood, was in some ways more dangerous. She pounded on the front door with both fists. "Dorothy!" Her voice was loud enough to carry half a block in the still morning air. "I know you're in there. Open this door right now. You did this. You destroyed my marriage, and I am not leaving until you admit it." I did not go to the door. I pressed the button on my security panel that activated the intercom. "Vanessa, you are violating the terms of your release. I'm calling Officer Reyes." "Go ahead. Call her. Let her hear what you've done. Hiring investigators to spy on me, turning my husband against me with lies, using the legal system to steal from us. You have 60 seconds to leave my property." She didn't leave. She dropped to her knees on my front porch, and I watched this on the camera monitor, watched this carefully assembled woman come fully apart on the steps of my front porch in the early morning dark, and she put her face in her hands. "I have nowhere to go," she said, and for the first time, stripped of performance and strategy and the expensive clothes and the composed smile, she sounded simply true. Not manipulative, not calculated. Just a woman sitting on cold concrete in yesterday's clothes with nowhere to go, and I thought, this is what it looks like when the whole structure finally comes down. I did not open the door. I called Officer Reyes, who arrived in 9 minutes. Ruth Holloway had already called before me. The security footage documented everything. Vanessa was taken in for violation of her release conditions. The 3rd time in 3 weeks she had been in the back of a patrol car. When I gave my statement to Officer Reyes on my front porch in the gray early morning light, I kept my voice steady and my account factual. Every word accurate. Nothing added, nothing softened. That afternoon, Ethan called. "I heard what happened this morning. Mom, I'm sorry. I told her to stay away from you." "I know you did." "Is she?" "She's dealing with the consequences of her own decisions," I said. "Which is exactly what should be happening. How are you doing?" A pause. "Better," he said slowly. "Actually, better." Vanessa's attorney, a sharp-dressed woman named Diane Fowler, who worked on contingency and had clearly been told that this was a harassment case built by a vindictive mother-in-law, filed a counter-motion arguing that the promissory note had never been intended as a binding legal instrument, that family loans were commonly understood to be gifts in practice, and that Dorothy Caldwell's lawsuit was part of a pattern of interference in her son's marriage. Robert Whitfield read the motion, set it down, and said, "She's going to try to make you look like the villain." "She's been trying to do that for 4 years, I said. "Let her try it in front of a judge." Robert and I spent the week before the court date building the documented record. 4 years of emails requesting payment, all unanswered or deflected. the recorded lien on the property, the 2 written statements from Brandon Teller and Craig Sullivan in Seattle and Portland, Gary Purcell's full financial investigation, the hotel receipts, the wire transfers to Ashley Greer's personal account, and Theodore Barton, who had agreed, quietly through his own attorney, clearly under some pressure from his wife to clean up the mess he'd helped create, to appear and give testimony. Ethan worked with his own attorney to complete voluntary disclosures on the mortgage and tax matters. It would mean penalties. It would likely cost him his current position. He did it anyway. I drove home from Robert's office on the Thursday before the court date and sat in my garden in the last of the October light. My roses were nearly done for the season, the petals going papery, the stems thickening for winter. I had always loved this time of year in the garden, the way things prepared themselves for the cold with a kind of deliberate, unhurried dignity. I thought about what Robert had said when I first came to him. Sometimes, Dorothy, the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is to stop protecting them from the consequences of their choices. I had spent 4 years being kind in the wrong direction, kind to the wrong person, extending patience that wasn't being received as patience, but as permission. I was finished being kind in the wrong direction. Tomorrow we would walk into that courtroom, and I would say something. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. I don't know what I had imagined. Something grand, perhaps, with high ceilings and the kind of gravity that matches the weight of what gets decided inside it. What I got was a room with fluorescent lighting, worn wooden benches that had absorbed decades of other people's worst days, and a smell of old paper and industrial cleaning solution that made everything feel simultaneously official and ordinary. I arrived 20 minutes early with Robert Whitfield wearing the navy suit, the same one I'd worn to Ethan's graduation, the same one I'd worn to Robert's office the morning after the arrest. It had become, without my planning it, the suit I wore when things mattered. Ethan sat beside me at our table, close enough that his shoulder touched mine. He had lost weight in the past 6 weeks. His face was leaner, older, and more his own than it had been in years. He'd told me the night before on the phone that he'd started running again. He used to run in college. He'd stopped somewhere in the first year of his marriage, he said, because Vanessa had found it inconvenient. He was running again now. Vanessa entered with Diane Fowler 4 minutes before the session began. She had dressed carefully for the role she intended to play. A conservative blue dress, modest heel, hair pulled back, makeup understated. The picture of a reasonable woman caught in unreasonable circumstances. She did not look at me when she sat down. She did not look at Ethan. She looked at Judge Beverly Norris's empty chair with the focused attention of someone doing mental preparation. All rise. Judge Beverly Norris was 61 years old with silver hair cut close and the bearing of a woman who had presided over enough family disputes to have developed a precise and efficient contempt for nonsense. She settled into her chair, arranged her papers, and looked at both tables with an expression that communicated, without words, that she had heard every version of every story and was interested only in documentation. Diane Fowler went first. She was good. I will give her that. She built her narrative carefully, brick by brick, with the practiced confidence of someone who had made weak cases sound reasonable many times before. She spoke of a young woman, her client, who had made some financial missteps, as many people do when managing a large and unexpected sum. She spoke of a mother-in-law who had never accepted her son's choice of wife, who had used a family loan, Your Honor, the kind that passes between relatives every day without legal intent, as a weapon to interfere in their marriage. She spoke of harassment, of a vindictive lawsuit, of a woman being punished for the crime of not being the daughter-in-law her mother-in-law had wanted. She made Vanessa sound like someone I would have felt sorry for if I hadn't spent 4 years sitting across from her at holiday dinners, watching her real face move behind the presented one. When Diane Fowler sat down, Robert Whitfield stood up. Robert did not tell a story. Robert presented a record. He entered the promissory note into evidence. He entered the recorded lien. He entered 4 years of emails, 17 in total, in which I had politely, patiently, and with complete cordiality requested that Ethan and Vanessa address the outstanding loan, and 17 responses that ranged from vague reassurance to complete silence. He entered the title company's closing documents showing that the lien had not been satisfied at the time of the sale, that the transaction had been completed with full knowledge that a recorded debt existed against the property and had been deliberately left unaddressed. Then he called Brandon Teller and Craig Sullivan, not in person, but through written depositions that he read into the record slowly and clearly. 2 men, 2 cities, $90,000. 2 decisions to stay silent. This is not a case of poor financial management, Robert said, addressing Judge Norris directly. This is a documented pattern of financial predation. My client is not the first person Vanessa Harlow has done this to. She is simply the first one who fought back. Then he called Theodore Barton. Theodore walked to the witness stand with the careful dignity of a man who understood he had no good options remaining and had chosen the least bad one. He was well dressed, gray at the temples, and looked as though he would have preferred to be undergoing dental surgery. Under oath, he confirmed the relationship. He confirmed the duration. He confirmed the financial support, the jewelry, the travel, the dinners. And then Robert asked the question that reframed everything. Mr. Barton, did Vanessa Mitchell represent to you that she was in the process of leaving her husband due to abuse? Yes. Did she tell you that her mother-in-law was attempting to fraudulently seize her assets through a civil lawsuit? Yes. That was how she described the situation. And did she request financial support based on this representation? She did. When did your relationship with Mrs. Mitchell end? Theodore's jaw tightened slightly. Approximately 3 weeks before these proceedings, my wife discovered the relationship and I ended it. And is it your understanding that Mrs. Mitchell's sudden need for housing, the visit to her mother-in-law's home described in this case, occurred shortly after you ended contact with her? Yes, that's my understanding. Robert thanked him and sat down. Diane Fowler's cross-examination of Theodore lasted 11 minutes and accomplished nothing except confirming everything he'd already said. Judge Norris had been taking notes throughout. She looked up from her legal pad now and studied Vanessa with the expression of a woman removing the last variable from an equation. Mrs. Mitchell, she said, not unkindly, but with absolute precision. Vanessa straightened. Do you dispute that your signature appears on this promissory note? No, Your Honor, but do you dispute that no payments were made on this note in 4 years? The circumstances were, yes or no, Mrs. Mitchell? A pause. No. Do you dispute that the property securing this loan was sold without satisfying the outstanding debt? Diane Fowler started to rise. Your Honor, my client was not personally— Counselor, I will hear from your client directly. Mrs. Mitchell, do you dispute that the property was sold without satisfying the debt? Vanessa's composure, which had held through Theodore Barton's testimony through what I can only imagine was sheer force of practiced will, began to show its seams. I didn't fully understand the legal implications, she said. Judge Norris looked at her for a long moment. You are 33 years old. You signed a legal document. The document specified repayment terms in plain English. Are you telling this court that you did not understand that borrowing money meant repaying it? It was family money. It wasn't supposed to be— Mrs. Mitchell. Judge Norris's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. A promissory note is a promissory note regardless of the relationship between the parties. The law does not make exceptions for family. She looked down at her papers, made a note, looked up again. I've also reviewed the assault charge and the witness statements, including the body camera footage from the responding officer's second visit to Mrs. Dorothy Caldwell's residence. She glanced at Vanessa. I want you to understand that I have read everything in this file. Everything. The room was very quiet. Judge Norris set down her pen. I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff. Mrs. Vanessa Mitchell is ordered to pay Mrs. Dorothy Caldwell the sum of $72,000 within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in wage garnishment and asset seizure proceedings. She paused. Additionally, given the documented pattern of financial deception presented in this case, including evidence of prior incidents involving 2 other individuals, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal fraud charges. This court is not in the business of rewarding predatory financial behavior with sympathy. She looked at Diane Fowler. Counselor, your client is 33 years old and has the full capacity to work, earn, and begin making restitution. I suggest she start immediately. She gathered her papers. We're adjourned. The sound of the gavel was still in the air when I heard Vanessa begin to cry. And even then, even after everything, I found myself listening for the quality of it. The way you listen to a sound you've learned to read. It was different this time, less controlled. The careful architecture of it was gone. Robert squeezed my arm and murmured something about paperwork. Ethan exhaled beside me. a long, slow release of breath that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than his lungs. I gathered my bag and walked toward the hallway. She was waiting just outside the courtroom doors. Diane Fowler was a few feet away, speaking quietly into her phone. Vanessa stood alone, her arms crossed, and when she saw me, she moved into my path with the last of whatever fuel she had left. "You think this is over," she said. Her voice was low and stripped of everything except the bare fact of her. No performance, no calculation. Just a woman who had lost and knew it and was not yet ready to accept it. "You think you've won?" I stopped. I looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time without the filter of anger or fear or the constant low-grade vigilance she had required of me for 4 years. I saw a 33-year-old woman who had spent her entire adult life acquiring things that belonged to other people and calling it living, and who was standing in a courthouse hallway with nothing left to acquire. "I haven't won anything, Vanessa," I said. "I got back what was mine. That's different." She stared at me. "I genuinely hope," I said, "that someday you find something that's actually yours, something you earned, something nobody can take back from you in a courtroom." I paused. "That's not cruelty. I mean it." I walked past her and didn't look back. I sold my house in Illinois in February. It wasn't a difficult decision in the end. The house had been mine for 28 years, and I had loved it thoroughly, and it had been good to me. But the rooms had accumulated too much of the past year. The echo of Vanessa's voice on my front porch, the memory of the morning I'd stood on those steps with my hand on my cheek, the specific silence of a son standing in a doorway, saying nothing. Houses hold things. Sometimes you need new walls. I found a small condo in a retirement community outside Tucson. Single-story, cream stucco exterior, a narrow strip of yard in the back that the real estate agent described as manageable, and I looked at as a challenge. The mountains were visible from my kitchen window every morning, turning colors in the early light that I didn't have names for yet, but was learning. I joined the gardening club on my 3rd Wednesday, the book club on my 2nd Friday. I planted heirloom rose bushes along the back fence in early March, the same late-blooming variety I'd had in Illinois, transported as bare root cuttings wrapped in damp newspaper, and waited to see if they would take to the new soil. Ethan flew out in April. He looked different. Not just thinner, but more present, more solidly himself, the way a room looks different when you clear out the furniture that was never quite right for it. He sat on my little patio in the Arizona sunshine and drank coffee and talked about his new job. Less money, honest work, a small engineering firm where people remembered his name, and about the apartment he'd found, small and clean, with a view of the lake. "Are you happy?" I asked. He thought about it. That was new. The thinking about it. The taking of the question seriously rather than deflecting it. "I wake up in the morning," he said slowly, "and I know exactly how much money is in my account. I know exactly what I owe. I know exactly what I can afford for the week." He looked out at the mountains. I didn't realize how much energy I was spending just managing uncertainty, just bracing for whatever was coming next. He paused. "Yeah, Mom, I think I am." He was making payments on the $72,000 according to a schedule he'd set up himself, monthly, on the 15th, without prompting. He had never once been late. I had told him 3 times that he didn't need to rush it. He had told me 3 times that yes, he did. The 4th time, I stopped arguing. It was a Thursday afternoon in late April, warm enough to be outside, and I was deadheading the roses when Margaret, my neighbor on the east side, a 70-year-old retired school teacher who had appointed herself my unofficial welcome committee, called over the fence. "Dot, there's a young woman at your front door. She's been standing there a few minutes. Looks like she doesn't quite know what to do with herself." I set down my shears and walked around to the front. She was 28, maybe 29, with dark brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, and the kind of tired eyes that come not from one bad night, but from a long time of carrying something heavy. She was holding a manila envelope against her chest with both arms, the way a person holds something they're not sure they should have brought. Her face stopped me. There was something in it, around the eyes, in the line of the jaw, that triggered a recognition I didn't want to have. "Mrs. Caldwell?" she said. "My name is Nicole Harlow. I know I have no reason to expect you to talk to me." She swallowed. "Vanessa is my sister." I stood in my doorway. In the 4 seconds of silence that followed, I considered closing the door. It would have been entirely reasonable. Nobody could have blamed me. Instead, I said, "Come in, I'll make tea." We sat on my patio in the afternoon light, and Nicole Harlow told me her story in the careful, halting way of someone who has rehearsed what they want to say many times and still isn't sure they're saying it right. She had grown up watching Vanessa. That was how she put it. Watching her, as if her sister had been a phenomenon to be observed rather than a sibling to be known. She described a pattern that had started in high school, the borrowed things that never came back, the friends who drifted away after their parents noticed money missing, the boyfriends who departed quietly and wouldn't say exactly why. Their parents had looked away. It was easier to look away. Nicole had not always looked away. She had tried, twice, to warn people. It had cost her her relationship with Vanessa and nearly her relationship with her parents. Now Vanessa was in Florida. She was using the name Vanessa Hartley. She had moved there 4 months ago, shortly after the court ruling, and had constructed a new narrative from familiar materials. She was a victim. She had been wrongfully pursued by a vindictive former mother-in-law. She had been dragged through a legal ordeal that had left her with nothing. She was in a relationship with a man named Philip Drummond, 58, widowed 18 months ago, owner of a small restaurant group in the Tampa area, a man still tender from grief and therefore perhaps less guarded than he might otherwise have been. Philip had already given Vanessa $60,000 to retain legal counsel for an ongoing case against her former family. He was, according to Nicole's research, considering adding Vanessa as a beneficiary to his estate. "I tried to tell him," Nicole said. She was holding her tea with both hands. "I found his contact information and I sent him a message. Just the basic facts, the court records, the newspaper coverage from the Chicago case. He thanked me very politely and told me he understood I was trying to protect my sister from a relationship he didn't think was my business." She paused. She'd already gotten to him, told him I was unstable, that I had a history of trying to sabotage her relationships. Did he believe her? He didn't disbelieve her, which is the same thing at that stage. I looked at this young woman across my patio table. She had driven, I would learn later, 17 hours from Memphis, where she lived, to find me. She had tracked me down through the court records, then through a forwarding address, then through a call to Robert Whitfield's office, which had confirmed only that I had relocated and that she could leave a message. She had not left a message. She had driven to Tucson. "Why come to me?" I asked. She looked at the envelope in her hands. "Because you're the only person who has ever taken her on directly and won. And because—" she stopped, started again. "Because I've been watching this my whole life and I've never done anything. I've watched her do this to person after person, and I've told myself it wasn't my place, it wasn't my business, it was too complicated." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. "Philip Drummond is a decent man who lost his wife and is lonely and trusting, and he does not deserve what is coming. And you think I can stop it? I think you can tell me how you stopped it. For yourself." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I set down my tea and said, "Give me that envelope." We talked until the sun went behind the mountains and the air turned cool enough to need a cardigan. I told her everything, not as a victim recounting injuries, but as a person explaining a process. The promissory note and why the documentation had mattered, the security cameras and why I'd installed them before I needed them, the importance of collecting written statements while witnesses still remembered clearly, the way Robert Whitfield had structured the lawsuit to tell a coherent story rather than a list of grievances, the choice to pursue charges rather than accept a private settlement, and why that choice had ultimately protected not just me, but the record. "The key," I said, "is that you cannot do this on emotion alone. Emotion is what Vanessa counts on, yours and everyone else's. She is very good at making emotional arguments that sound like facts. You need actual facts. You need paper. Philip Drummond may not listen even with paper." "He may not," I agreed. "You cannot save someone who has decided not to be saved, but you can make sure that when the consequences arrive, and they will arrive, they always arrive, there is a clear record of what happened and who did what to whom. For his sake, for yours, and for the next person." Nicole was quiet for a moment. "She called me last week," she said. "She knows I've been asking questions. She told me I was betraying the family. She cried." "Was it convincing?" A pause. "It used to be," Nicole said quietly. "Less so now." "That's how you know you're seeing clearly," I said. Not when you stop feeling anything, but when you can feel it and still know what's true. Nicole left at 9 o'clock with the manila envelope significantly thicker than it had arrived, supplemented by copies of the court records Robert had sent me, Gary Purcell's contact information, and 3 pages of notes she'd taken in a small spiral notebook she'd produced from her bag. At my front door, she turned back, the way people do when there's one more thing they haven't found the right moment to say. "Mrs. Caldwell, Dorothy, I'm sorry for what my sister did to you and your son. I'm sorry I didn't do something sooner." "You're doing something now," I said. "That's what matters." I watched her taillights disappear around the curve of the street and stood there for a moment in the warm Arizona night, listening to the particular quality of silence that belongs to the desert, vast and still and somehow patient, as if it has been here long enough to know that everything eventually settles. I went inside and locked the door. My phone was on the kitchen counter. It showed a text message from an unknown number that had arrived while Nicole and I were talking. "You think moving to Arizona makes you safe. It doesn't. This isn't over. I read it twice. I noted the timestamp. I took a screenshot. Then I blocked the number, forwarded the screenshot to Robert Whitfield with a one-line note, for the file, and set the phone face down on the counter. I put the kettle on for a final cup of chamomile. Through my kitchen window, the last light was leaving the mountains, the rock going from copper to shadow, in the slow, unhurried way of things that have been doing this for longer than any of us have been here to watch. Vanessa could send messages from every number she could find. She could move to Florida and change her name and build a new story from the same worn materials. She could tell Philip Drummond, or whoever came after Philip Drummond, whatever she needed to tell him. She could do all of it, and I would have cameras, and an attorney, and documentation, and the hard-won knowledge that the truth does not require permission to exist. It only requires someone willing to keep saying it. Ethan called at 9:30. He always called on Thursdays now. It had become our thing without either of us declaring it, the way good habits form, quietly and without announcement. "How was your day?" he asked. I looked out at the darkening mountains. "Interesting," I said. "I'll tell you about it." We talked for an hour and 20 minutes. About Nicole and Philip Drummond, and what might happen next. About his new job and a hiking trail he'd found on a weekend, and a colleague he'd mentioned twice in the past month in the slightly offhand way that means something. About Gerald, a little, how his father used to say that the measure of a person wasn't what they did when things were easy, but what they did when the cost was real. After I hung up, I put on my garden gloves and went out to check the roses in the last of the light. They were doing well. Better than I'd expected, honestly. The Arizona soil was different from what they knew, drier, sharper, less forgiving, and for the first weeks after planting I had worried that I'd asked too much of them, transplanting something so established into ground so foreign. But roses are tougher than they look. Put them in honest soil with enough sun and enough water and get out of their way, and they will do what they were made to do. One of the cuttings had set its first bud. Small, tight, the deep red of the variety I'd been growing for 15 years, unchanged and unhurried, doing what it had always done in the old yard, becoming itself, regardless of where it happened to be. I stood in my Arizona garden in the warm dark and looked at that bud for a long time. Then I went inside, washed my hands, and went to bed. Some chapters end not with a crash, but with a door closing quietly. The kind you know won't open again. And in the silence after, if you're still enough, you can hear the sound of something new beginning. I am 64 years old. I am not finished. Neither are my roses.